Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Danger on Delmarva. My name is Rhonda Franny Jefferson, and thank you so much for taking some time to listen today. This is the second episode of a two-part series that I'm covering on the murders of Billy Winebrenner, Melody Pistorio, and Gregory Taylor. These were the murders of 3 teenagers, as well as 2 other people were kidnapped, and yet another person was shot but thankfully survived. So I do always give a disclaimer in my episodes that, the discussions that we have will, detail some triggering events such as, murder, injury, death, in this case also child abuse, and even discussion of the death penalty. So the topics are usually pretty heavy and serious, but in this case there's even a couple other types of events that are occurring within all one crime spree that happened in the summer of 1990. So I do normally have a longer intro, but the only other thing I will add is, it's very vital that you listen to part 1 first. So if you've not done so yet, please go back and listen to the prior episode. I'll also link it in the description along with the sources as normal. Because of the length of the episode will probably be pretty long, I just want to get straight into the events that occurred after the trial and convictions of John Thanos for all of the charges that were brought against him, and those were what I previously just mentioned. The only other thing that I will add is I normally mention that I also will go into YouTube and upload a video that includes some pictures or, other things that I think are more visual with the case. A lot of times it's, pictures of the victims with some pictures also of the convicted. However, I guess because of the time frame, I really could not find any pictures of Melody, Billy, or Gregory when I did a Google search. The only pictures I found were for another Gregory Taylor that was involved in a murder case. So, there were really no confirmed pictures that I could use. So, because of that, I decided just to upload the audio. So, it will still be there if, someone does prefer to listen on YouTube, have it going on in the background. But at the same time, I'm not going to have the normal pictures that I would have. This also goes for the previous episode, even though I'd anticipated being able to find some photos to use, I wasn't able to. Let's pick up where we ended yesterday, which was a quote made by Thanos' mother after his conviction and in response to the sentence of the death penalty. And I'm just going to repeat that quote because I think it's kind of a good segue, both ending yesterday's, or I should say the previous episode. I just recorded it yesterday compared to when I'm recording this, but it kind of encompasses both a reaction of what he'd just done as well as transitioning into the penalty. So Patty Thanos said that her son once told her, "I want to kill in order to be killed." And she further added, he said he was getting too old and didn't have the guts to kill himself, so he was going to have a shootout with police, end quote. So this was, something he had mentioned in the past. In, the wake of him being sentenced to death and him deciding not to fight it, she and her daughter did try to file appeals for him, but Thanos did not want them to. He said he accepted, the sentence, and in fact, during the actual penalty phases, it did seem as though he made that pretty clear that he wanted the death penalty. Now, I do also think it's important to explain a little bit about how Maryland went about the process of carrying out an execution, especially considering they had not done one in quite a while. So, the state of Maryland had not performed an execution in more than 3 decades. Within those 3 decades, the Supreme Court did actually have a moratorium on the death penalty, and as such, the Maryland legislation that kind of governed the death penalty, it lapsed. So once the Supreme Court had lifted the moratorium, then Maryland did not reinstate it. They did not reinstate it until 1994, which was 4 years after Thanos had committed his crimes. But, given any case where you would want to reinstate it, the prosecutors really looked at this one and decided to move forward with requesting the death penalty. Also, Maryland did not publish the date and time of an execution. This goes back to a law from 1922, and it was in response to the way that the death penalty was carried out at that time. It was carried out by public hangings, and there had been crowds, and even in cases of people, for lack of any better word, storming the deceased and collecting souvenirs and taking things from the executed person's body. So in response, there was a law enacted in 1922 so that only the corrections commissioner knew the exact day and time as to when the execution would occur. What occurred then was everybody involved that would need to be there for the execution was given a week block of time. So from Monday 12:01 a.m. to Sunday 11:59. So whoever was involved knew that there was a possibility they could be called in for the execution to take place. Certain officers of the court or those who were required to be there, as well as some journalists, were given 3 hours notice, whereas the convicted was given only 1 hour. In order for the family of the convicted person to spend time with them before the execution, they were allowed to come visit the week prior. What this did, though, was, for the victims' families, some of them did want to be there. And so, of course, it could have taken away from some of their sense of closure by not being able to be there. Now, just one observation that I made was looking back at some cases, especially cold cases that I've watched documentaries on or I've read about. Usually, if someone is convicted and sentenced for a crime, they have to be sentenced on the guidelines of when that crime occurred. So if someone committed a crime 30 years ago, and usually if they're convicted after 30 years, it would be a murder case since there's no statute of limitations, they would be sentenced on the, murder, or if there was manslaughter, whatever they ended up being convicted for or pled to. The sentencing would be based on the minimum and maximum timeframes in, the law book at that time. So looking at this one, I'm kind of wondering, since, Maryland did have the death penalty on the books, but it just was not reinstated, was that something that the attorneys for Thanos could have looked at and said, this is something that's invalid, the actual sentence of the death penalty is invalid because it had not been reinstated yet? Or was it still valid because even though it hadn't been reinstated, it was still a part of the law books, so to speak. I didn't really find anything on that. It was just something that I found interesting. And, since it did not say that any of the attorneys brought that up, I'm thinking it was kind of a moot point. Again, it was just kind of something that I saw, and it brought to mind some cold cases I'd seen in the past. Now, Thanos' attorney did provide a little bit of a more intimate glimpse into Thanos' mind. He had spent a lot of time with him over the course of many cases. And what his attorney said was, what he did was reprehensible. That's true. The other thing is he is extremely damaged. He is an extremely damaged human being, and really, in our society, we should not kill sick people. He really is a sick person. So I think to a certain degree, anybody who commits crimes that are even comparable to this, so murder, kidnapping, senseless violence, to an extent, I think we can all say they are damaged to a certain degree. And of course, those degrees vary depending on the individual circumstances. But, to say that someone who commits horrendous crimes is not, at least to a little bit of a degree, I almost hate to use the word damaged, but that's what was used in the quote, is damaged. That really, I don't think there's really any argument that there has to be at least a little bit for them to commit those crimes. But this kind of brought me back to Patty's quotes, where she said that her son had actually just come out and said he wanted to be killed. Now, this was 1990, and even though the discussion of mental health is somewhat taboo today, it was extremely taboo then. So even though my first natural instinct was when I read this, didn't she reach out to somebody? John was now no longer in the home under the thumb of an abusive father. He was an adult. So why didn't she reach out to someone to get him help? Because not only would it be helping him, but looking at the aftermath of what occurred after this conversation, then many, many other victims would not have fallen victims to his crimes, and their families wouldn't also have to have dealt with the repercussions. Then I had to think, there was no internet where she could have gone online and tried to find, resources for him. And even if there was the internet, would there have been resources available? So, going forward, I think we also need to take a step back and realize this is not a case that's occurring today where, we would be able to reach out to, different services, whether it was the local division of social services. I know it's different names in different states, but that same general idea, national helplines, those just weren't a thing then. So my first instinct was to really question Patty, but I think she had limited resources to really act on. Now, I did mention, Thanos did not want to really fight the death penalty. He did not want anybody to file appeals, but people did continue to do so on his behalf. The ACLU, or the American Civil Liberties Union, was one of those entities, and they kind of echoed the concerns about how competent Thanos was. Some legal representatives even tried to have him declared incompetent and put his mother and sister in charge of his decisions, but that did not work. The big question then comes, is this state-assisted suicide? So looking at the competency of Thanos at this time, as well as looking back at when he committed the crimes, the court then had to look at what was his mental state. Was he technically, either not competent to be active in his decision-making, or, was he not competent at the time, and that would mitigate the penalty or the punishment. This did bring about a few different doctors with differing opinions. Two mental health experts testified on behalf of the defense, and they said that Thanos had borderline personality disorder, and that along with that disorder came difficulty with controlling anger, and he also had a poor sense of self. So, with this, diagnosis, I looked into the exact definition of borderline personality disorder, and according to BetterHelp, which I have to say is not a sponsor, it's just where I found a good definition, or what seemed to be, a good definition, described borderline personality as, quote, a disorder is a mental health disorder that impacts the way you think and feel about yourself and others, causing problems functioning in everyday life. It includes self-image issues, difficulty managing emotions and behavior, and a pattern of unstable relationships. So, given this description, it really, in some ways, describes a lot of people. There's trauma in many people's pasts that, can lead to some or all of these symptoms that were just mentioned in this definition. So there are many ways in which then borderline personality disorder can present itself. Now, first, I am not in any way a mental health expert. I will share that I have, had my own mental health struggles, and at times I've had crippling anxiety. Thankfully, I've been treated, and I'm still undergoing the treatment to maintain, my ability to control the anxiety. Now, when I was much younger, and this is actually the first time I'm discussing this particularly, I was also diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. My description would be that it was at a low level. There really wasn't, any follow-up with me regarding that. I had, met with a therapist or a psychologist. It's really been so long ago, I can't even remember what the exact credentials were. And she said that, I had some of the, I guess you'd say, personality traits. And there really just was no follow-up, though, beyond that. So that's why I'm describing it as low level. Now, some people, just overall have a fear of being abandoned, and that can come from incidents in their childhood or early adulthood, just things that have happened that have created this sense of, being alone or having those that they love abandon them. And just so happened that within 24 hours of recording the first episode, I actually either read about or watched documentaries of different cases that, the suspect or the convicted was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. I just found that interesting that within such a short period of time, I came across really randomly. I was not looking at cases. One documentary did just happen to be one that covered a few different crimes, so it was mentioned multiple times for a couple of different people on that particular documentary. So I really had to wonder about the just long list of symptoms that that presented in borderline personality disorder. I also had to kind of look at it and think, is that a term or disorder that's being used to just encompass a wide array of symptoms that many different suspects or criminals happen to have? It just seemed like that was a lot of people, a lot of cases with all the same disorder. Now, the thing is, as with any other mental health disorder, Most people who have borderline personality disorder, and I'll be calling it BPD going forward, they live functional and productive lives. They've either learned to cope with the symptoms through either treatment, whether that be therapy or through medication or both. And in some cases, it may have almost erased, those symptoms as long as they keep up the treatment and be cognizant of what those symptoms are. Now, one psychiatrist named Thomas Goldman, who testified on Thanos' behalf, talked about how Thanos' family life had influenced the man that he had become. Well, in a lot of ways, that kind of goes without saying. Anybody's family will influence, to some extent, what they become as an adult. Goldman went on to say that BPD in Thanos was because his young life had really been chaotic. He did specifically point to an instance where Thanos' father had punched him in the groin. He also cracked a bone in the wrist. It was described as a psychic torture. The other psychologist that testified on behalf of Thanos said that borderline personality disorder would not allow him to act in the ways in which society would deem appropriate. And quoting from the article, it said, Thanos' personality disorder prevented him from conforming his behavior to the requirements of the law. Donner continued to say that he is a very seriously disturbed individual. Personally, I think that is a bit of an understatement there, to say the least, given the crimes that he committed. But at what point does having a disorder then say, okay, that's enough of a mitigating circumstance that either the convicted should not be given whatever sentences are available for the crimes he committed, or that the person needs to undergo mental health treatment in a facility and not a prison. On the reverse side of the coin, we also had a doctor testifying for the prosecution, and that was Neil Blumberg. He did concur that Thanos had borderline personality disorder. However, he did not see that the BPD would impact him to the point that he'd not be able to distinguish that shooting innocent people who posed absolutely no threat to him was a bad thing to do. In other words, he knew right from wrong. In the judicial system, the ability to tell right from wrong is really a keystone to determine if a person was or was not suffering some type of mental impairment, or was able to distinguish that what they were doing could cause a harmful impact, and it was something that they should not do. Even though a person may have BPD, that does not mean they can't distinguish between right and wrong. And even though they may have issues controlling their anger, it cannot be then an excuse to commit crimes without repercussions. Every day, we see people convicted because they have issues with anger. There are anger management courses, and we hear of people being sentenced to the anger management courses after they've had a conviction. A lot of times it's with a first offense. I can't say it's with every first offense. I'm just saying typically, those are some of the avenues that are taken instead of just jail time or in conjunction with jail time in certain cases where anger was really the overwhelming factor. So we can't just dismiss out of hand that if someone has trouble controlling their rage, okay, does that mean they're suffering from a mental illness and then can no longer be held responsible to the fullest extent of the law for the crimes they commit at that time? My thought would be that if many crimes were just sentenced based on that mitigating factor, that they may have a personality disorder or have trouble controlling their anger, society would be in a very, very difficult position, because a lot of crimes would then be going unpunished. I think also, given not only Thanos' case, but just also the influx of a lot of cases that have the diagnosis of BPD. And even though I've mentioned 5 cases I saw within a very short period of time, there have also been cases in the past where that was the diagnosis that I've either read or heard about. So, again, it can't really be used as the catch-all diagnosis. And I also feel that it does a disservice for those who do have a mental illness or mental disorder, personality disorders, to say that, basically, if you use those as complete mitigating factors, it's saying then that most people with these types of disorders can't control themselves. I think that is completely unfair and illogical, considering the vast majority of people who have, whether it's anxiety, rage issues, BPD, every day do what they need to do to become and be or continue to be productive members of society. They don't commit outrageous crimes that are harmful to dozens, if not hundreds of people and affect the community. So it really does do a disservice to the millions and millions of people who approach every day having a mental disorder, who successfully navigate the day and don't do things like this. It's just, for me, it seems rather insulting to almost insinuate that it should be used as a mitigating factor in this case, because then it just opens up this domino effect, in my opinion. Arguments supporting the fact that BPD should have been a mitigating factor did make me think then, what should be the treatment then if this was really looked at as a large mitigating factor and Thanos was not going to be executed? What type of treatment plan would he have had? It was extremely obvious that he was violent, and he had served much of his adulthood in and out of jail. So after his conviction, whether or not he was going to serve a long lifetime sentence in jail, or if he was awaiting the death penalty, what type of treatment would he have? Would he, as an individual, be able to have that choice? Or since he was in the custody of the state, I guess you would say the penitentiary system or penal system, would he really have a say in it, or would the state determine his treatment? If he was in jail, would he be undergoing treatment to make sure the other prisoners were kept safe? Because it's obvious at this point that he does have trouble with anger and does not think things through. If he was in a treatment center instead of going to jail, again, the issue has to be raised. How would you keep everybody else in that facility safe, whether it be patient or staff, visitors? Because, how would you be able to control Thanos's anger? And this would apply not only to him, but anybody else who would use this as the mitigating factor in their punishment. At what point does society, the government that legislates punishment and treatment, would there ever be a point in time where they would say, it's not up to the individual in regards to what kind of treatment plan they have, it is up to the state entirely? Does that then infringe on the person's civil liberty? So again, it just creates this whole domino effect to use something as pretty much the sole mitigating factor, and that was the BPD. And what I'm saying in regards to that, when I say it's the only mitigating factor, I'm using it to kind of cover everything because the doctors stated that it was abusive childhood that brought forward the BPD. So I'm not negating the abusive childhood. I'm just saying it's all included within the BPD. So that and it's, just the treatment itself then of BPD also brings up its, entire litany of questions in regards to civil liberties as well, because it is the job then of the prison system and the state to keep other prisoners safe. No matter what one may feel about that, it is definitely, you have to treat, make sure that other other prisoners are kept safe as well. And having someone who has such rage issues would be very difficult in a hospital or treatment center condition as compared to a prison. There are so many things that are really finely nuanced in this case, and it's hard to sit back and just take everything in. That's why I said this was going to be a very long episode, because I have notes, I have an outline, but still, as I'm talking, more and more things are coming to mind. And who knows, it may even end up being longer than I anticipated. But that's just because there are so many fine points to this. We can look at it and just say it's the case of an angry man who, for no good reason, not that there's ever a good reason to kill someone other than in self-defense. But, he, again, did not feel any threat coming from any of the people that he harmed. So no reason, killed people, kidnapped people, shot another man, not to mention all of the other crimes that he committed before then. He was a dangerous man. And at what point does the protection of society outweigh the liberties of an individual? The debate over the death penalty will always be a very intense one, a very polarizing one, and it really is something that cannot be taken lightly. It's looking at putting an individual to death. And there are so many things that can come into play when coming up with that sentence. And it begins with, just for one, the decision as to whether or not the prosecution's even going to seek the death penalty. I don't think any single person within the confines of law would ever enjoy the prospect of going after the death penalty for someone. It's something that is not taken lightly, and nor should it be. When discussing the death penalty, things do have to be considered. And yes, one of them is the mental state of the convicted. There are people who have very valid mental illness or disorders that do severely impact their judgment and need to be treated. There are, very, very true and valid instances of this. So I'm not saying at no point should mental illness never be considered as a mitigating factor. I'm just saying, looking at this case, I think that he knew right from wrong. So looking at the mental disorder and the abuse in the past, yes, okay, that was part of him, that did happen to him, and we can have sympathy and empathy for the child that he was, and that he was never given the opportunity to grow up in a, loving and, caring home. But again, there would be the whole domino effect of what would we allow then everybody who was in those circumstances to do. So again, those who do legitimately fall under, not knowing right from wrong, not being able to control themselves at all, do need to be treated. That is something that we cannot ever stop looking at, because once we do stop looking at the mental state of the convicted, the fairness or equity and application of any sentence, really would be tossed away. And so we do need to make sure that fairness and equity is part of every single criminal conviction, every sentence. And we also have to look at what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment while still acting as, a just system, and looking at whether or not it should be used as a deterrent for crime. That is also up for debate. Some people say yes, some people say no. We then have to look at the callousness and cruelty of the crime. To be convicted and sentenced to death, it would involve then the murder of another person, at least one, in this case, multiple people. So that is pain and loss and grief felt by each victim's loved ones, the community around them, and sometimes there is no healing completely after these violent crimes. And if anyone has ever been the victim of a violent crime, even if it was not murder, the impact stays forever. I had a friend whose car was stolen. That is a minor property crime. And I say minor because she did get the car back. But she didn't feel safe anymore where she lived. I've watched testimony of a woman whose house was broken into, and she found he'd been in a number of different rooms, even into her bedroom while she was at work. She knew that this person had friends and family in the community, and even possibly an accomplice. So the security that this person felt in their own home that they'd lived at for decades was gone. And some of the things that were stolen could not be replaced. So even looking at nonviolent crimes where the person, the victim, is not confronted by the offender, it still leaves that mark. So then when you think about a victim who's been kidnapped, in this case, a poor man spent hours, most of the day, in a trunk in the hot summer on Delmarva's Eastern Shore, which is extremely hot and muggy, and the fear he must have felt. The last kidnapping victim that was taken at gunpoint as a getaway driver, basically, not knowing what might happen to him or her, whoever the driver was. The person who was shot and survived, what they feel to this day, and was there a sense of, loss of security, and then all of their families worrying about their loved ones as well. And then for the families of these three teenagers, they'll never get to see them meet certain milestones. Two of them never even, got to their final year in high school. And while Gregory was 18 years old, he never got to graduate. They'll never get married, never have children, know the joys of succeeding in their careers. All of that was taken away from them, from their families, and that can never be given back, no matter what the sentence. So that brings us to something that I found pretty interesting. There can be very, very wide, I guess you'd say, array of feelings when it comes to the application of the death penalty within both the legal system as well as even within the victims' families. I'm just going to go over a couple of quotes by law enforcement and an attorney, what they said after Thanos's conviction and sentencing to death we've heard from Thanos' attorney. This next quote is going to come from a young officer at the time when Thanos committed these crimes. His name was Mike McDermott, and he said, "I was working on the shore when Thanos was caught. The only reason he was put to death was because he demanded it. You would have thought he was Hannibal Lecter the way he was handled. He would have killed again, and I don't have any problem with that application of the death penalty." So looking at this, I actually see two trains of thought that I can take away from it. So it's very clear that McDermott is definitely good with the death penalty. But what I questioned earlier was, is this state sanctioned, suicide basically? That's even mentioned in here in a roundabout way. It said because he demanded it. That can call into question Thanos' mental state. Then you kind of measure that with the part where he said he would have killed again. So there's a lot of a balancing act within that one quote. Now, going on to Randy Coates, who was the Worcester County State Attorney. And if you are looking this up, Worcester looks like it's spelled like Worcester without the H, but it is pronounced Worcester. He said, "Personally, I don't feel that strongly one way or the other about the death penalty. But if anybody on earth deserved to be put to death, it was John Thanos. He had no redeeming value as a human being. He was unique in his evil." And that's a strong statement to say that a person has no redeeming value as a human being. That's one of the strongest statements to me that you can make about another person. Now, Lois Burton was Gregory Taylor's mother, and she supported the death penalty. In another article that was not specifically about this case, but it was about the death penalty, she was quoted as saying, "I definitely have no problem with the fact that John Thanos was executed. I think it's only fair that the death penalty be kept and be enforced for those of us that have to suffer through appeal after appeal. I don't really understand the statements of the inhumane way they have to die. I think my son died a very terrible death," end quote. So just to clarify, she does mention the appeals. So even though Thanos had not filed appeals, like I mentioned, other people did file them on his behalf. And as far as her discussing, people making statements about the death penalty being inhumane, she does go back to the way her son died and the fear that he felt. He was taken out to a forested area tied to a tree, and, the whole time pleading for his life. So just from the description of the final, few moments of Gregory Taylor's life, we know that he was in fear, as I think everybody would be. But in that same article, there was another Maryland woman interviewed. Again, she was not part of Thanos' case, as the article was more on the death penalty in Maryland. But Erica Bridgeford's younger brother was shot in Baltimore and died. She said that the death penalty wouldn't do anything to ease her pain. Her quote was, "It just felt less and less like justice to me. Vengeance is a very dark, painful place." So this shows the two unique differences of feelings regarding the death penalty from two people who've lost loved ones. And I can see both sides to that. Thinking back to if one of my children, goodness forbid, ever, were even just injured by another person, I would feel enraged and I would want justice. And what that justice was, as I've not been in the particular situation of my child being injured in that way, I can see the mother's feelings. I definitely can. I've also been in a situation where I knew that someone who committed murder against someone that I loved was truly remorseful and really wasn't an active participant as compared to others in his, I guess you would say, friend base. And to a certain degree, letting go of, the, I don't, hate is a very strong word, but in the immediate aftermath, I can say I felt hate towards everybody involved in that. But after some time, and in that case, even after just a couple of days, I could feel changes in my emotions and how I looked at each individual. And I know for me, it was beneficial to let go of the hate against a person who was truly remorseful. So there's, again, just this wide range of emotions. And as no other family member in regards to any of Thanos' victims were interviewed that I could find, we can't say that, other parents or loved ones would not be on the other side of the coin saying, I don't think that another person should lose their life, because I've heard that said in other cases as well. Again, very polarizing topic. Now, what can we really take away from this case besides the, dozens of things we've already discussed? I think, and I said to myself early on, I was not going to inject a lot of personal opinion, but I think it's almost impossible. But I think prevention has to begin with early life. And now we are in a better place as a society to address that. And I think that it's our duty to do so. At the time that Thanos was growing up, there probably was a lot of feeling of a man's home is his castle, which is, why even if Thanos's teachers, doctors, may have even stepped in, we don't know what the attitude of law enforcement at that time would have been. And not just talking police officers, talking attorneys that would have prosecuted it, judges, remembering that Thanos' final conviction took place in 1990. But, he had been in and out of the judicial system for decades. So, we're going back to the 1950s. Really, would there have been a lot of early intervention on Thanos' behalf at that time? But right now, we know that there are children out there who don't have the support that they need, whether it's just the support to be given as far as encouragement, helping to build a child's self-esteem, to encourage the things that they love, to protecting them from the people who are supposed to love them most in their lives. So, within any probably classroom at almost any school, you're going to find children who have a very strong home base and have the support academically, emotionally, to grow up to be very productive, adjusted adults. You also then probably have children who have very little support, whether it's, the financial situation the family may have, whether it's one single parent in the home, who does have to work in order to provide for their child, but does give them the love and support that they need emotionally. Then, you have the far end of the spectrum where you have children who are being abused. And what role does society need to play there? And we need to play an active role in preventing it to begin with. So see something, say something. to not be afraid to become involved and, be a support for those children in those situations so that they know they're not alone, and to try to ease that sense of abandonment that they may have when a loved one is the person who is abusing them. And then, yes, that means there may become a situation where the state does need to take the child out of that home. That, I'm sure, is extremely traumatic for the child, because even though they're living in an abusive setting, that is the only setting they know. So there's so many different factors that every different child in a classroom has a completely unique experience. And we need to show a level of support for every single child, with recognition that some need more support emotionally, some need more support physically because of types of abuse they may be experiencing. And along with those physical abuses, then will come a need for mental and emotional support as well. And I don't think it's good to make a blanket statement saying, like, this is where society's involvement should end. That's not going to help anybody. Thinking back to when I was a child, I remember hearing someone once say that they didn't feel like they should have to pay, the city taxes to pay for schools because they didn't have any children, never planned to have children. And I know that's at a very, I guess you would say, a base level, thinking, okay, well, they're not putting any children into the school system, so why are they paying taxes? It's not only for that reason, but each child that goes through the school systems, they become a member of society. And we want every child to become a very active, productive, well-adapted member of society. And that begins when a child is young. And if for some reason that's not seen when they're extremely young, then as they grow up and these things become apparent, then there needs to be intervention then. The goal is then twofold. It's to support the child, give them the resources they need to turn them into the productive member of society. I know I keep saying that term, but it is really what it comes down to. Everybody wants to be a productive member of society and wants their children to grow to be productive members of society. But on the reverse side of that too, if you take one child that is going through something like this and you turn their life around from possibly, committing crimes and spending time in prison to going out and getting a job, raising a family, contributing to, all different aspects of their community, not only are they doing that, but then their potential victims are saved from, whatever trials and tribulations they would have had to go through. And I think that's something that's often overlooked, that, when there is some type of intervention and anybody is given the emotional and mental and even physical support that they need, you're not only changing their lives, but you could be changing lives of people that you don't even think of. Now, in the second episode of this podcast, I covered the story of a man that I thought from the very beginning I would, leave the research, feeling the same way I had at the time of the crimes. And this is a man who shot a number of people in one day very close to where I lived. Many people were shot and survived, but with lasting injury. But 2 men were left dead, with 8 children left without their father. But going through the history of that person, he was abused as a child. His brother was as well. And even though that abuser was taken out of their life for a while, eventually they came back into these boys' lives. There was really no intervention, other than the time period where the abuser was away. It seemed like he had been in jail, but the reintroduction of him back into their lives had to make them feel betrayed, abandoned, and they continued to be abused after that. And both of the sons in the family ended up murdering at least one person. And I ended up leaving the episode with a feeling of both he and his brother did need to pay for their crimes. I had no problem with them spending the rest of their lives in jail because they hurt so many people. But I had to wonder what would have happened if even one person stepped in earlier on in their lives and helped them get, counseling and therapy, a recognition that they had been through something horrendous, but there was help there now. What difference could that have made in not only their lives, but in every person that they hurt as adults when they committed their crimes? So I don't know if that's a popular opinion or not. And again, I'm not saying that they should not have been punished for their crimes, because they did need to be punished. I'm just saying that things may have turned out differently with an earlier intervention. In Thanos' case, who was, looking at the time frame, it was a much older case then. I don't even know if those interventions would have been there, but even if they were, he does and did need to be punished for the crimes that he committed. Now, one of the arguments that were made against not only Thanos, but anyone getting a death penalty, especially if they began their criminal career as someone very young, people began to argue, and they still do, as far as the size of the discussion about whether or not putting people in jail is good or bad, just in the sense that putting someone around other criminals usually tends to give them more resources to become a better criminal, as well as hardens the person. Thanos was described as a very slight individual, which means, in prison and juvenile detention, he was probably picked on a lot. And that can be said that it both damaged him and also hardened him. So it exposes then the criminals early on to a regime that focuses more on punishment than it does on the actual rehabilitation. But looking at rehabilitation, unfortunately, no one state budget has the availability to enable the tons of extra staff that would be required to truly work with individual prisoners and get to know their strengths and weaknesses, understand any trauma they may have been through, and focus on the things that individual prisoner would need to help to contribute to society once they were released. A balance is attempted, but if we were all to be honest, that balance doesn't even get close to where it needs to be most times. I just said there really needs to be almost an availability to work one-on-one with a prisoner to make sure they get everything they need to be rehabilitated. It's nowhere near that. And, again, I think it goes back to stopping the crime before it starts by using resources when people are younger. I truly think that it would use fewer resources to help prevent crimes from occurring later. I know we'll never be able to prevent all crimes, but I'm just saying that an earlier safety net will help catch more and overall benefit society much better than looking at rehabilitation and punishment when people become adults, because I really think once they get into an adult prison, it definitely is more about punishment than rehabilitation, just because there is not enough staffing. Um, Again, just my opinion, and that's based on the experiences that I've seen personally. I've shared that I've had a lot of personal experience, with knowing a lot of people who have been victims of violent crime, and how it impacted family, how it impacted, just everybody around them, and knowing what I know about the backgrounds of those convicted, I think that earlier intervention is the key. And that's probably cliche, because I know a lot of people say that, but just putting it on a personal level, I really think personal intervention was a key. And I do stand by any punishments that the offenders received, because it does not take away from the fact that they hurt others, and that's a pain and grief that will never be overcome. It then would begin that downward spiral of, if we set these sets of parameters as mitigating circumstances to lessen a punishment, then what happens if the victim of that crime then commits a crime, and that's used as a mitigating factor that they were a victim of a crime themselves, and so forth. It just would keep going without any possibility really of stopping. So let's just kind of nip that in a bud and say, yes, we can understand that this happened to someone, but it does not then give them the right to go into a community, a society, and hurt other members. I did find a quote that Thanos once said that I think gives us an insight as to whether or not he knew what he was doing, whether or not he was competent to understand the pain that he was inflicting. He once said, "I have no laws. People are merely my pawns." So this just says to me, he at least attempts to control the narrative. He decides how people see him. And in fact, in prison, a lot of people said he was kind and even soft-spoken, which is, absolutely amazing, considering how he acted at other times. Listening to the first episode, he had many, many court outbursts. So after seeing this quote, that people are merely my pawns, it says to me he knows how to act, when to act that way, who to act that way around to manipulate those around him. But he got to a point where, people kind of saw through his facade. The one facade was he tried to act tough all the time, but that in a way was kind of posturing, because he had felt abused all of his life, not only by his father, but also when he was in prison, because he was a smaller statured person. He also would try to be, in the terms used, soft-spoken and gentle when it fit his needs, because he was able to probably manipulate people into believing he was a truly good guy. That, to me, shows a competency. He did things throughout the crimes that showed that he was competent to understand what he was doing was wrong, because he took actions to hide, as far as changing up vehicles. He tried to alter his appearance to look somewhat like Gregory Taylor. So he knew that what he was doing was wrong. There's no doubt about that. And he made conscious and clear attempts to evade justice, even though he had made a quote to his mother saying he wanted to be killed. When it came down to it, as far as being captured, yes, he shot back at police, but he was ultimately captured without being injured at all. So just in regards then to, I guess, the level of culpability of an individual within society is, I'm just going to say that we are humans. We are influenced by many different things in our lives, but most of us have the ability and even attempt to discern the difference between right and wrong, even if we have gone through trauma in our young lives. Every year, thousands and thousands, even billions of people make the right choices. They don't steal something because they want it, they just try to work harder. They don't attack someone because someone else treated them poorly earlier in the week. Every day, people make these decisions not to act out on those impulses that can hurt others. They still function as members of society and could probably never imagine hurting someone. But just ending there, I said we're all humans. And speaking of being human, I just want to bring up a few last points. Were there mistakes made? I'm not talking about recognizing intervention or anything like that. Just plain basic mistakes. Yes. How was he let out early? Now, originally, through probably 7 or 8 articles, I found barely any information at all. The most information I could find at one point was a line that just said there was a miscalculation with the time that he was to serve. And so at that point, I was looking at it thinking, okay, was there a certain percentage he had to serve and someone put a decimal point in the wrong place or used a wrong percentage? What did they mean? But it was, like I said, near the end of the articles that I was reviewing where I found one that actually said, what actually occurred. Each prisoner was given what was termed as good time credits, and they based the date of release on that. So probably, like time off for good behavior type of thing. However, the person who was in charge of calculating that credit for John Thanos actually counted credits from an earlier prison sentence, which was the 21-year sentence. So when Thanos was, convicted or supposed to serve 8 years, the credits from a 21-year sentence were used, and from what I could kind of interpret in the article, along with the ones for the actual, 8 years, that caused him to be released 18 months earlier than his, earliest time frame if those credits had been calculated correctly. So 18 months early, which means he would have still been in jail at the time of these crimes if he had not been released early. And so we're to lawsuits. And while I could not find what came from the lawsuits, there were articles that did, either allude to or just outright say that the families of each victim was suing the state. And, I will say sometimes I think the U.S. is a very, very litigious society and should not be filing lawsuits as often as we do. But in this case, I think it is understandably so. This was a violent criminal that was let out early. And I even questioned the 8 years if that was long enough. So to have been let out so early when he had committed violent acts of crime in the past, I mean, that was just a setup for failure. And this was a failure on the ultimate sense. I mean, 3 people were killed. He had 6 total physical victims with that crime spree. 3 murders, 1 attempted murder, 2 kidnappings. And all because someone looked at a wrong sentence. So was this double checked? Did someone else have to sign off on it? The person who made the calculation was fired, yes. but were there safeguards put in place to make sure that this did not happen again? I mean, that seems like a pretty big mistake to make. And, to go unnoticed was the big thing. The other mistake that I have to wonder about is, how did he get a gun? So I was relatively young when all of this happened, so I looked up the gun laws at the time, and I found something called the Gun Control Act of 1968. The act follows the premise that we're familiar with, that if you're a felon, you cannot own a gun. You cannot own ammunition. Thanos bought this gun from a sporting goods store in Salisbury. When I heard he had a gun, my thought was it was some type of private sale. He saw an ad on or in the newspaper, someone was selling something, and he bought it outside of normal channels. But no, it was bought in a sporting goods store. Now, under this act, the 1968 Act, the seller is supposed to check with what's called the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. So, it's called NICS. So yes, there's things missing as far as the acronym, but this would basically govern whether or not a person could get a gun. Now, some states, for some reason, would give allowances for a felon to be able to own a gun or ammunition, but there were two issues with this. One is that the selling of the gun would still be under federal regulations, so technically, even if the state gave back those allowances, it was still under federal authority. And second was just based on Thanos's actions. I don't think he would have been patient enough to wait for the check to come back on him. So if he had not really, been able to, however, get the gun from the sporting goods store, he probably would have still found another way to get the gun. So there wasn't anything mentioned about how he was able to get it other than it was at a sporting goods store. Did the clerk not follow procedure? Did Thanos talk him into, selling it earlier than the normal wait period? We don't know. But he also was able to purchase ammunition when he was not supposed to do that either. So I think that's something that really needed to have been explored. And if it was, then it should have been more prevalent in some of the articles, because as someone who lives in the community, I would want to know, how did this happen, so I could try to at least feel a little bit more secure. But, if there were any mentions of that, it was in probably paid sites, which, for one, I don't usually go into paid sites because that can add up. But also, I don't want to use sources that other people can't view either. So there will always be two very different trains of thought regarding the death penalty. On the one side, many will say it is never, ever acceptable to kill someone with premeditation, even if it's under the death penalty, and you've gone through everything, such as the trial and the appeals, that it's never right to take away someone's life. On the other hand, you will have dozens of family members and friends, co-workers, even people that didn't know the victim because, they just live in the community and want to feel more secure. They have another point of view, and especially the families and loved ones, they suffer anguish about not being able to see that person again. And, not seeing that person grow and become fulfilled. And so sometimes the victims' families and loved ones would be very adamant about, supporting the death penalty. And even outside the person's family and friends, members of the community, again, in, wanting to feel safe and to see what they consider just punishment, would still support the death penalty. I believe that there's probably The vast majority of people may fall somewhere in that middle. And that's not saying that an individual at one point in time may say, I don't believe in the application of the death penalty. And then if something happens to one of their loved ones, if their viewpoint would change, or even vice versa, if someone once believed the death penalty should be meted out, if something happens to one of their loved ones, if they change their feelings, thinking that they don't want to see another life taken. I don't think you're ever going to have a clear consensus about the death penalty in the U.S. at least. I know I do have some listeners who are from other countries, so those may be in places where the death penalty is not an option. But I know in the U.S. it's always going to be something that brings out so many different emotions, as it should. I've said from the beginning, the death penalty is not something that should be taken lightly. And I do remember an instance as I was probably around 10 or so, I think, when Ted Bundy was executed. And a child in my class made some type of joke about it. And I can't even remember the joke, but I remember the teacher was in tears because, just of how solemn the application of the death penalty is, and whether or not, you believe someone should be put to death for their crimes, knowing that it is an act that is going to end someone's life is a very, very heavy thought. So it's something that should continue to always be discussed, because if not, people are not going to be able to move ahead. There was a time period where, pretty much, and I'm talking, a century or more ago, where the death penalty was very commonplace, but there was no room for leniency. If someone had a mental disorder, or say if they had a developmental disability, then that was not always taken into consideration, and the death penalty was still applied. If there were no discussions, we never would have been able to move past those cases and understand that there are legitimate mental disorders where the person may not be able to be held fully culpable. There are also instances of those who do have developmental disabilities who may not have known what they were doing was wrong. So we have to continue to have discussions. But it's never going to take away the pain that people on any side of this coin feel if they or loved ones have been victims of crimes. I think we have to respect each other's viewpoints, because otherwise it's just going to end into a shouting match with nobody listening to each other and not being able to have the respect and understanding of why another person feels the way they do about something that is so polarizing. Someone once told me, as far as discussing viewpoints with another person, they said, no matter what, always go into the discussion with respect. And of course, I'm paraphrasing here because I was actually told this probably when I was about 12 or 13. But go into that conversation with respect, because, for one, if you don't respect another person's viewpoints enough to listen to them and to really give them the respect that they deserve, why would you expect them to listen to you and give you the respect that you deserve? And on top of it, you know what? You may actually learn something from that person, and they may actually learn something from you. So enter each discussion with respect and an understanding that the other person has a different viewpoint than you. Respect their right to have a different viewpoint than you do, and be open, be honest, and it all came down to respect. That's something that stayed with me my entire life, so that even if there are times emotionally I want to jump into a conversation, I always take a step back and say, I can't say what that person has been through in their life and why they hold the viewpoints that they do. And I'm not just going to make an assumption that they're wrong and I'm right, or vice versa. That, if you're going to jump into a discussion that is very emotion based, go into the discussion, even if you have to take a couple of deep breaths first, but go into it in a calm, even manner, so that, you're starting off on a good kind of sound footing in the conversation. So I know we've covered kind of a lot of different opinions. There's probably so many things that I've not even gone over through in my notes. But on the other hand, I may have actually gone over them, just not in the same order. But this, I know, is a very heavy topic. This was some information regarding specifically John Thanos' case and the state of Maryland, as well as, the attorneys, law enforcement that were part of the case. But we do have to look at it as a society in general, and that's kind of more where I put my opinion in. There really was not a way to separate things 100%. I hope that in a lot of ways I tried to represent the feelings of both sides. But if you are listening to this or watching on a format that allows comments, please be respectful, because again, we never know what another person's been through in their life, and we want to make sure that we give them the respect they deserve, and conversely, again, make sure you're giving the other person the respect that they deserve. All of my contact information will be in the description as normal. If you do have any, case topics that you would like to have me cover, please let me know. Now, the last few episodes have been about crime, but I do also look at cases of, natural and man-made disasters and what we can learn from them. So, if you do have cases that you want to cover in any of those fields, but I will talk to you all later in about 2.5 weeks. That's normally the time frame between episodes. And again, just, please be respectful, and not only in the conversation about the death penalty, but I really am a firm believer as far as respecting everybody else's opinion, because, if we do so, they'll be more open to listen to us, and both of us can learn something from each other. All right, thank you, everyone. Try to have a good weekend and the next couple weeks. Talk to you soon.